Why medieval prisons were worse than death in the modern world. Prison is considered a humane alternative to execution. We view incarceration as punishment that allows for the possibility of redemption, rehabilitation, and eventual return to society. But in medieval times, being sentenced to prison was often considered a fate so horrific that many criminals would beg for immediate execution instead. Medieval prisons were not institutions of correction or rehabilitation. They were chambers of slow, deliberate torture designed to break the human spirit completely before finally claiming the body. Today, we explore why these dungeons were considered worse than death itself, and how they became monuments to humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty. Our journey begins in the depths of medieval castles, where the concept of imprisonment took on meanings that modern minds can barely comprehend. Unlike today's prisons, medieval dungeons were never intended to house criminals temporarily or prepare them for eventual release. They were designed as places where people would go to die slowly, over months or years of unimaginable suffering. Picture the Tower of London in the year 1200. Beneath the impressive stone walls and royal apartments lies a network of underground chambers that would make hell itself seem merciful. These are not cells in any modern sense, but stone pits carved directly into the bedrock, accessible only through narrow openings in the floor above. The most feared of these chambers was known as Little Ease, a cell so small that a grown person could neither stand upright nor lie down fully. Prisoners confined here were forced to remain in a permanent crouch, their muscles cramping and joints dislocating over weeks of immobility. The psychological torture of being unable to assume any comfortable position gradually drove inmates to madness. But physical discomfort was only the beginning of medieval prison torture. The designers of these dungeons understood that the human spirit could be broken more effectively through psychological torment than through simple physical pain. Medieval prison cells were deliberately constructed to maximize sensory deprivation and psychological distress. Most dungeons were built completely underground, with no windows or natural light sources. Prisoners would spend months or years in absolute darkness, losing all sense of time and gradually forgetting what the world outside looked like. The silence was equally devastating. Many dungeons were designed with thick stone walls that blocked all outside sounds. Prisoners would go weeks without hearing human voices, gradually losing their ability to speak coherently. When guards did visit, it was often only to deliver minimal food or to check whether the prisoner was still alive. The food provided in medieval prisons was designed not to sustain life, but to prolong death. Prisoners typically received one meal per day, consisting of bread made from sawdust and grain sweepings, water that was often contaminated with human waste, and occasionally scraps of rotted meat that even dogs would refuse. This starvation diet served multiple purposes. It weakened prisoners physically, making escape attempts impossible. It created constant hunger pangs that dominated every waking moment. Most importantly, it ensured that death would come slowly, over months rather than weeks, maximizing the duration of suffering. But medieval prison designers understood that physical deprivation alone was insufficient to achieve their goals. They developed elaborate psychological tortures that attacked the mind as systematically as starvation attacked the body. One of the most devastating psychological techniques was the use of false hope. Prison guards would regularly inform inmates that their release had been ordered, leading them through elaborate preparation rituals before revealing that the release was canceled. This cycle of hope and despair would be repeated dozens of times, gradually destroying the prisoner's ability to maintain mental equilibrium. Another common practice was forced isolation from all human contact, followed by sudden exposure to crowds of strangers. Prisoners who had spent months alone in darkness would be dragged into brightly lit courtyards filled with jeering spectators, creating sensory overload that often triggered permanent psychological damage. Medieval prisons also employed what we would now recognize as sophisticated methods of sleep deprivation. Guards would wake prisoners at random intervals throughout the night, preventing them from achieving restorative sleep. This technique, continued over weeks or months, caused hallucinations, memory loss, and complete psychological breakdown. The physical conditions in medieval dungeons were designed to maximize disease and suffering while preventing quick death. Most cells had no sanitation facilities of any kind. Prisoners were forced to live in their own waste, creating breeding grounds for diseases that would cause prolonged illness rather than quick death. The stone floors of dungeons were often covered with several inches of filth accumulated over years of use. This mixture of human waste, rotting food, and decomposing remains from previous prisoners created an environment so toxic that simply breathing became an act of endurance. Rats, lice, and other vermin thrived in these conditions, but rather than being eliminated, they were considered part of the punishment. Prisoners would be partially consumed alive by rats, while too weak from starvation to defend themselves. Lice and fleas would cover their bodies, creating constant itching and the spread of disease. The dampness in underground dungeons was another carefully maintained feature. Water would seep through stone walls, creating conditions that promoted respiratory infections, joint problems, and skin diseases. Prisoners would develop consumption, pneumonia, and other wasting diseases that would kill them slowly over months. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of medieval prisons was the complete uncertainty about the duration of imprisonment. Unlike modern sentences with defined end dates, medieval prisoners were given no information about how long their punishment would last. They could be imprisoned for weeks, years, or the rest of their lives, with no way of knowing which. This uncertainty prevented prisoners from maintaining hope or developing coping strategies. The human mind needs some sense of future possibility to maintain sanity, and medieval prison designers deliberately destroyed this by making the future completely unknowable. The treatment of different classes of prisoners revealed the sophisticated cruelty of medieval justice systems. While common criminals might be imprisoned in standard dungeon cells, political prisoners and those who had offended powerful nobles received special attention designed to maximize their suffering. High-ranking prisoners were often placed in specially constructed cells that provided just enough comfort to make their deprivation more psychologically devastating. They might receive slightly better food or occasional glimpses of sunlight, but these privileges would be withdrawn randomly, creating cycles of hope and despair that were more psychologically damaging than consistent deprivation. Female prisoners faced additional torments designed specifically for their gender. Many medieval prisons included special chambers where women could be subjected to sexual humiliation and assault as part of their punishment. These attacks were not random violence, but systematic psychological warfare designed to destroy their sense of self-worth and dignity. Children born in medieval prisons faced perhaps the most tragic fate of all. They would grow up in darkness and filth, never seeing sunlight or experiencing normal human contact. These children often died in infancy, but those who survived were frequently driven insane by their environment before reaching adulthood. The guards who operated medieval prisons were carefully selected and trained for their psychological suitability to inflict prolonged suffering. Unlike executioners, who needed to be efficient and quick, prison guards needed to be capable of maintaining cruelty over long periods without becoming emotionally involved with their victims. Many prison guards were chosen from among criminals themselves, offered reduced sentences in exchange for tormenting other prisoners. This created a culture of systematic abuse where guards competed to devise new methods of psychological and physical torture. The most skilled prison guards understood that the goal was not to kill prisoners quickly, but to break them psychologically while keeping them alive as long as possible. They developed techniques for maintaining prisoners at the exact edge of death without allowing them to cross over into the relief of actual dying. Water torture was commonly used in medieval prisons, not as a method of execution, but as a way of creating prolonged suffering. Prisoners would be given just enough water to survive while being constantly tormented by thirst. The water they did receive was often contaminated or mixed with substances that would cause illness without immediate death. The use of chains and restraints in medieval prisons was designed not just to prevent escape, but to cause maximum physical discomfort over long periods. Prisoners were often chained in positions that would cause severe muscle cramps and joint damage, but not immediate injury that might lead to quick death. Iron collars, leg shackles, and other restraining devices were deliberately designed to cause constant pain and discomfort. These devices would often cause wounds that would become infected, creating additional sources of suffering that would last for months. Medieval prison designers also understood the psychological impact of complete helplessness. Prisoners were stripped of all personal possessions, including clothing, leaving them naked and vulnerable. This nakedness served both practical and psychological purposes, preventing concealment of escape tools while also destroying dignity and self-respect. The removal of all personal identity was another crucial element of medieval imprisonment. Prisoners were often forbidden to use their names and were referred to only by numbers or crude nicknames. This systematic destruction of personal identity was designed to break down the prisoner's sense of self before death finally claimed them. Religious prisoners faced additional torments designed to attack their spiritual as well as physical well-being. They might be forced to participate in ceremonies of opposing faiths or subjected to constant blasphemous speeches designed to corrupt their religious beliefs and add spiritual despair to their physical suffering. The architecture of medieval prisons reflected their purpose as instruments of prolonged torture rather than simple containment. Cells were built with features designed to maximize psychological impact, irregular shapes that prevented comfortable positioning, walls that wept moisture constantly, and ventilation systems that provided just enough air to prevent suffocation while maintaining an atmosphere of staleness and decay. Some medieval prisons included special chambers designed for specific types of psychological torture. Forgetting chambers were cells where prisoners would be left in complete isolation for months, often forgetting their own names and personal histories. Screaming chambers were designed with acoustic properties that would amplify and distort sounds, creating an environment of constant auditory torment. The most sophisticated medieval prisons included multiple levels of increasing severity. Prisoners might begin in relatively comfortable cells and gradually be moved to worse conditions as their sentences progressed. This progression created a constant state of dread about what might come next, preventing any psychological adaptation to their circumstances. The record-keeping systems in medieval prisons were designed to maximize the psychological impact of uncertainty. Guards would maintain detailed records of prisoner behavior and condition, but this information was never shared with the prisoners themselves. This created a sense of being constantly watched and judged by invisible authorities. Visiting policies in medieval prisons were carefully structured to increase rather than decrease psychological suffering. Family members might be allowed to visit prisoners occasionally, but these visits were designed to demonstrate the prisoner's degradation rather than provide comfort. Visitors would see their loved ones in advanced states of physical and mental deterioration, creating trauma for both prisoners and their families. The medical care provided in medieval prisons was designed to prevent death without alleviating suffering. Prison physicians were instructed to treat only conditions that might cause quick death, while allowing painful but non-fatal conditions to persist indefinitely. This medical attention ensured that prisoners would live long enough to experience the full psychological impact of their confinement. The economic system surrounding medieval prisons created additional incentives for prolonging prisoner suffering. Families could purchase small improvements in their loved ones' conditions, but these improvements were minimal and could be withdrawn at any time. This system created a cycle of hope and despair while extracting additional punishment from prisoner families. The release procedures from medieval prisons were designed to maximize the psychological impact of the imprisonment experience. Even prisoners who were eventually freed were often released in such degraded physical and mental condition that they could never fully recover or reintegrate into society. Many former medieval prisoners became permanent social outcasts. their experiences having destroyed their ability to form normal human relationships or maintain employment. This served as a visible warning to potential criminals about the long-term consequences of imprisonment. The construction techniques used in medieval prisons demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and physiology. Stone was carved to specific textures that would be uncomfortable against human skin. Drainage systems were designed to maintain exactly the right level of dampness to promote disease without causing immediate death. Lighting systems in medieval prisons were carefully controlled to maximize psychological impact. Some cells included small openings that would allow tiny amounts of light to enter at random intervals, preventing complete adaptation to darkness while not providing enough illumination to be truly helpful. The legacy of medieval prison design influenced correctional philosophy for centuries afterward. Even as societies began to develop more humane approaches to criminal justice, the fundamental assumption that imprisonment should involve deliberate suffering rather than simple containment persisted in many legal systems. Modern psychological research has revealed why medieval prisons were indeed often worse than death. Prolonged exposure to the conditions found in these dungeons would cause permanent changes to brain structure and function, creating psychological damage that could never be fully healed. The combination of sensory deprivation, social isolation, physical deprivation, and psychological torture found in medieval prisons represented perhaps the most systematic assault on human consciousness ever devised. These institutions were designed not just to punish crime, but to destroy the essential humanity of their inmates. As we reflect on the horrors of medieval imprisonment, we are reminded both of how far human civilization has progressed in developing humane approaches to justice, and of how recently these improvements have occurred. The sophisticated cruelty of medieval prisons demonstrates that the capacity for systematic torture exists within human societies and can be justified by legal and moral frameworks that seem reasonable to those who create them. The echoes of medieval dungeon walls remind us that the difference between justice and torture often lies not in the intentions of those who design punishment systems, but in their willingness to recognize the fundamental humanity of those they seek to punish. The medieval world forgot this principle, creating institutions of suffering that indeed proved that some fates could be worse than death itself.